I'll never forget the morning my father threw me off the family ranch. He didn't throw me out in anger. He threw me out like he was finally getting rid of a problem he'd wanted gone for years. "Get off my ranch." My father pointed straight toward the front gate as if he were aiming a rifle. The Texas sun had barely cleared the horizon, morning mist drifted over the pastures, and the smell of fresh-cut hay hung in the cool air. Ranch hands stood beside their pickup trucks with steaming coffee in their hands, waiting for another ordinary day. Horses shifted inside the corrals, and the old windmill behind the barn turned with its familiar creak. Then everything stopped. Conversations died in the middle of a sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to people's lips. Even the horses lifted their heads, sensing something was wrong. "You heard me," my father barked. "Get the hell off my ranch, and don't ever come back." He stepped toward me, ripped the old silver ranch tag from my jacket, and threw it into the dirt. It landed between my boots with a sharp metallic clink. "Take your little keepsake," he said. "It's the only thing you're leaving here with." Across the yard, my younger sister laughed as she aimed her phone at me. She had already started a live stream. "Looks like Dad finally got rid of the family parasite." Thousands of strangers were about to watch the worst day of my life. My mother didn't tell her to stop. She folded her arms and quietly said, "You should have done this years ago." No one defended me. Not the men I'd worked beside for years, not the neighbors who'd watched me grow up, not even the people who knew I'd spent every sunrise and every storm helping keep that ranch alive. Because everyone standing there believed the same thing, that my father was the rightful owner of Dawson Ranch. They were all wrong. I looked down at the silver tag lying in the dust. My grandfather used to rub that same piece of silver with his thumb whenever he had a difficult decision to make. The last time I saw him alive, he pressed it into my hand and told me, "One day, this will remind you who you are." I picked it up, brushed away the dirt, and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't tell my father that by sunset, every word he'd spoken would come back to haunt him. As I reached my truck, he shouted one last time, "If I ever see you on this property again, I'll have you arrested." I opened the driver's door, then looked back. "You might want to cancel tomorrow's board meeting," he frowned. "What board meeting?" "The one where you're going to find out." I glanced once more at the ranch stretching across the Texas hills. "You just threw the owner off her own land." I used to believe family meant standing together when life got hard. Growing up on Dawson Ranch, that wasn't just something my grandfather preached. It was the way we lived. When the fences broke, everyone grabbed a hammer. When calves were born in the middle of the night, everyone lost sleep. When drought hit, nobody ate until the livestock had been fed. That's how my grandfather built the ranch, not with money, with loyalty. He used to say, "A ranch isn't measured by acres, Claire. It's measured by the people willing to fight for it." Back then, I believed every word. I was 8 years old the first time he trusted me with real work. Most kids my age were afraid of horses. Granddad handed me an old feed bucket that was almost too heavy to carry and said, "If you want these animals to trust you, show up every day. They don't care what you promise. They care what you do." I spilled half the grain before reaching the first stall. He never laughed. He simply picked up another bucket and walked beside me. From that day on, every summer, every school break, every free weekend, I was on the ranch long before sunrise, long after sunset. By the time I turned 16, I could mend fences, deliver calves, repair irrigation pumps, and drive every piece of equipment we owned. People around town used to joke that I worked harder than most grown men. Granddad would only smile. "That's because she loves this place." He was right, I did, not because of the land, because it was home, or at least, I thought it was. My father saw things differently. To him, the ranch wasn't a family legacy. It was an investment. He was always talking about expanding, buying neighboring land, building luxury guest cabins, bringing in investors from Dallas. Granddad hated those conversations. "You don't turn heritage into a business plan," he'd tell him. "You protect it." Dad would roll his eyes every time. Sentiment doesn't pay bills. The arguments became more frequent as the years passed. Sometimes they lasted for hours behind the office door. Sometimes they exploded in front of everyone. I never understood all the details. I only knew that whenever Granddad walked out of those meetings, he looked a little older. Then my sister, Emily, came back from college. She wasn't interested in cattle, or fences, or branding season. She was interested in cameras, social media, luxury brands. She loved taking pictures beside horses she'd never fed and tractors she'd never driven. Online, people thought she was the face of Dawson Ranch. Offline, most days she couldn't tell one end of a hay bale from the other. It didn't matter. Dad adored her. Emily knows how to make this place profitable. Every time he said that, he looked at me as if all the years I'd spent working beside Granddad counted for nothing. I told myself it didn't bother me, that actions mattered more than attention. I was wrong. Because little by little, I stopped being seen as the granddaughter who kept the ranch running. I became the daughter who was simply expected to do the work. No praise, no thanks, just expectations. If a water line burst, I fixed it. If a ranch hand called in sick, I covered the shift. If storms destroyed fencing, I was already loading posts into the truck before anyone asked. Nobody noticed when things went right. They only noticed if something went wrong. Granddad noticed every single time. One evening, after we'd finished repairing miles of fence damaged by a spring storm, we sat together on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he handed me a bottle of root beer. "You know why this ranch is still standing?" I shrugged. "Good cattle," he laughed. "No. Because every generation gets one person willing to carry everyone else's weight." I smiled. "So who was it before me?" He looked across the fields. "My father." Then he looked back at me. "And now, it's you." At the time, I thought he was giving me a compliment. I had no idea. He was also giving me a warning. The first time I realized my father had already chosen his favorite. I was 23. Granddad had been in the hospital for nearly a week after suffering a mild heart attack. The ranch couldn't stop just because he wasn't there. Calves still had to be fed. Payroll still had to be signed. Equipment still had to be repaired before harvest. For 7 straight days, I barely slept. I handled deliveries before sunrise, worked alongside the crew until dark, then spent half the night going through invoices at the kitchen table. Nobody asked me to do it. The work simply needed someone willing to carry it. On the 8th morning, Dad finally came back from Dallas. He walked into the ranch office, looked around for less than 30 seconds, and asked one question. "Where's Emily?" I stared at him. "I've been running this place all week." He barely looked up from his phone. "I wasn't asking about you." That should have told me everything. Instead, I kept trying. A month later, Granddad returned home. His doctor told him to avoid heavy work for a while. Dad smiled, nodded politely, then disappeared into another business meeting. So the responsibility landed exactly where it always did, on me. Granddad noticed. One afternoon, he found me replacing broken fence posts by myself under a brutal August sun. My gloves were torn, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I hadn't stopped since daylight. He leaned against the truck and watched quietly until I finished driving the last post into the ground. "You've been out here since 6 this morning. I'll finish before dark. You've skipped lunch." I wasn't hungry. He smiled sadly. "That's a lie your grandmother used to tell me." I laughed. He didn't. "Claire, one day you'll learn that the people who always carry the load become invisible." I brushed dirt off my jeans. "I don't mind. I know, that's exactly what worries me." At the time, I thought he was worried I was working too hard. Now I know. He was worried about something much bigger. A few weeks later, Dad announced a family dinner. That almost never happened. He stood at the head of the dining table, holding a glass of bourbon. "I've made a decision." Emily smiled before he even spoke. "We're expanding the ranch." He began passing out glossy brochures. Luxury guest cabins, wedding venues, corporate retreats, swimming pools overlooking the valley. The place looked more like a country resort than a working ranch. Dad's eyes sparkled with excitement. "This is the future." Emily clapped. "It's going to be incredible." Everyone looked at me. I took a slow breath. "What happens to the grazing land?" Dad frowned. "We'll reduce it." "The cattle? We'll scale back?" "The families who lease pasture from us every season? They'll adjust." Granddad quietly folded the brochure and laid it on the table. "No." The room fell silent. Dad's jaw tightened. "No?" "I built a ranch. You want to build a resort?" Dad slammed his hand against the table. "You built this place 50 years ago. The world has changed." Granddad didn't raise his voice. "Integrity hasn't." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Dad looked at me. "Well, whose side are you on?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. I looked at the drawings one more time, then at my grandfather. If expanding means destroying everything this ranch stands for, I can't support it. Emily let out an exaggerated sigh. There she goes again, Miss Perfect. Dad offers a real opportunity, and Claire wants us to stay stuck in the past. I ignored her. Dad didn't. He stared at me with a look I'd never seen before. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't anger. It was resentment. The kind that doesn't disappear overnight. The kind that quietly grows until it becomes something much darker. That night, as everyone went inside, Granddad remained alone on the porch. I joined him. Neither of us said anything for a while. The sun was disappearing behind the hills, painting the pastures gold. Finally, he spoke. Do you know why your father keeps pushing so hard? I shook my head. He thinks owning land makes a man important. Granddad looked across the ranch he'd spent his entire life building. But land has a way of revealing who people really are. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small brass key, old, worn smooth by decades of use. He turned it over once in his hand, before placing it in mine. Keep this somewhere safe. I looked at it, confused. What does it open? He smiled. When the time comes, you'll know. I slipped the key into my pocket, never imagining it would become the most valuable thing anyone had ever given me. Granddad died on a cold November morning. The first frost of the season still covered the pasture when the phone rang. By sunrise, every light inside the main house was glowing against the gray Texas sky. No one spoke much. A pot of coffee sat untouched on the kitchen table, while neighbors quietly pulled into the long gravel driveway, their pickup trucks crunching over the frozen stones, one after another. The ranch had never felt so still. No diesel engines roared to life before dawn. No voices drifted from the equipment barn. Even the horses stood quietly along the fence line, their breath rising in slow white clouds, as if they somehow knew the man who had greeted them every morning for 40 years wasn't coming back. For the first time since I was a little girl, Dawson Ranch didn't feel like home. It felt like a place that had lost its heartbeat. 3 days later, the little white church outside town filled long before the service began. Pickup trucks stretched along both sides of the county road. Cowboy hats rested against weathered chests. The smell of cedar, leather, and cold November air followed people through the front doors. They came from 3 different counties. Old ranchers carrying worn canes, young families whose children Granddad had once taught to ride horses, former employees who hadn't worked for him in decades. One by one, they stood beside his casket. Each carried a different memory. He gave me my first job. He paid my mortgage when the drought wiped us out. He never let my family go hungry. Listening to them, I realized something. Most people measure a man's life by what he leaves behind. Granddad was being measured by the lives he'd lifted. I stood beside my parents, greeting everyone who came through the line. My cheeks hurt from forcing polite smiles. Dad accepted every handshake with quiet confidence. People kept telling him how proud his father had been. And he nodded as though those words naturally belonged to him now. Emily cried whenever someone stopped in front of her. The tears disappeared almost as quickly as the condolences. She knew exactly when people were watching. After the service, the cemetery overlooked the rolling hills Granddad had spent his life protecting. The wind tugged gently at the American flag folded beside his casket. As the final prayer ended, people slowly returned to their trucks. I stayed behind. I wasn't ready to leave him. The fresh earth hadn't even settled yet. I knelt beside the grave and ran my fingers through the cold grass. I don't know how to do this without you. You already do. The voice came softly from behind me. I turned. Walter Briggs, Granddad's attorney. He had been part of our family for so long that I couldn't remember a Christmas without seeing him at our table. His gray coat fluttered in the wind as he walked over. He rested one hand gently on my shoulder. Your grandfather asked me to tell you something. I wiped my eyes. What was it? Walter smiled. The ranch has always known who loved it. I frowned slightly. Before I could ask what he meant, he continued. He also said, don't let anyone convince you that hard work goes unnoticed. I almost laughed through my tears. It already has. Walter slowly shook his head. No, Claire, it hasn't. His answer confused me. Before I could ask another question, Dad's voice carried across the cemetery. There you are. He walked toward us with his hands in his coat pockets. His face no longer looked like a grieving son. It looked like a businessman trying to finish a meeting. "We're heading back." Walter gave him a polite nod. "I'll see everyone Tuesday." Dad watched him carefully. "Tuesday?" "The probate hearing." Dad's expression relaxed. "Right." As Walter walked away, Dad watched him longer than necessary. Then he looked at me. What did he want? "Just checking on me." Dad nodded once. But something in his eyes lingered. Curiosity, suspicion, maybe both. 2 days later, rain tapped softly against the windows of Walter's law office. The conference room smelled of old leather, polished oak, and coffee that had been sitting on the warmer too long. Granddad's framed photograph rested on a side table, beside a single vase of white lilies. No one looked at it. Dad sat at the head of the table with both hands folded, calm enough to make it obvious he believed he already knew how the afternoon would end. Emily quietly scrolled through her phone. Mom adjusted the sleeve of her black dress. I couldn't stop staring at the empty chair across from me. Only a week earlier, Granddad had been alive. Now all that remained were papers carrying his signature. Walter entered carrying a thick leather folder. He sat down without rushing, removed his glasses, then unfolded a handwritten letter. "Your grandfather asked that this be read before anything else." The room became perfectly still. Walter began reading. "If you're hearing this, I'm finally getting some rest." A few soft chuckles broke the silence. Even Dad smiled. Walter continued. "Don't waste your time fighting over what I've left behind. Families usually start arguing over land long after they've stopped protecting each other." Nobody moved. The rain continued tapping against the windows. Everything I've ever owned had only one purpose: to protect Dawson Ranch. Dad shifted in his chair. Walter never looked up from the page. "Some people loved this ranch because of what it could make them. One person loved it because it was home." Without realizing it, I lowered my eyes. When I looked up again, Walter was looking directly at me, only for a second. Then he continued reading. Dad noticed. I saw his smile disappear, just for an instant, but it disappeared. Walter folded the letter with surprising care and returned it to the folder. "Now we'll proceed with the estate." The next 20 minutes unfolded exactly the way Dad expected. The main house, investment accounts, vehicles, equipment, livestock. Each item was read aloud. Each distribution seemed perfectly ordinary. By the time Walter reached the last page, Dad leaned comfortably against his chair, already looking like the new head of Dawson Ranch. Walter closed the folder. "That concludes today's probate hearing." Dad frowned. "That's everything?" "Yes." "What about the ranch?" Walter calmly met his eyes. "The ranch isn't part of this estate." Silence. Dad blinked. "I'm sorry." "The ownership of Dawson Ranch was legally transferred before Mr. Dawson passed away." Emily let out a confused laugh. "Transferred? To who?" Walter slowly stood. "I'm not authorized to discuss that today." Dad pushed his chair back so hard it slammed against the wall. "That's my father's ranch." Walter picked up his briefcase. It was. Then he walked toward the door. No one followed him. No one even spoke. The only sound left in the room was the rain against the windows. Almost without thinking, I slipped my hand into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around the old brass key Granddad had given me. For the first time, I stopped wondering what it opened. Instead, I started wondering what it had been protecting all these years. Life on Dawson Ranch didn't change after the probate hearing, at least, not on the surface. The sun still rose over the same rolling hills. The cattle still gathered near the south pasture before sunrise. The windmill still creaked through long Texas afternoons. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. Inside the family, everything had. Dad never mentioned Walter's words again, not once. It was as if pretending the conversation had never happened would somehow change the truth. Instead, he acted even more like the owner. New business meetings filled his calendar. Developers from Dallas started showing up every few weeks. Men in pressed suits walked across grazing fields, wearing polished shoes that sank into the mud. They talked about profit margins, luxury cabins, event venues, golf carts. They never talked about cattle, or the families whose livelihoods depended on that land. Granddad hadn't even been gone 3 months. His legacy was already being measured in dollar signs. I stayed out of those meetings, not because I agreed, because no one wanted me there. If I spoke, Dad called me emotional. If I stayed quiet, he called it maturity. Either way, my opinion never mattered. So I buried myself in work. Before daylight, I was checking water tanks. By noon, I was repairing broken fencing. Most evenings ended in the machine shed, covered in grease, fixing equipment that should have been replaced years earlier. The crew still came to me when something went wrong, not because I was the boss, because they knew I'd show up. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, old Ben Carter found me replacing a hydraulic hose on one of the tractors. Ben had worked beside my grandfather for almost 35 years. His weathered hands looked like they'd been carved from leather. He watched me struggle with a stubborn wrench before quietly taking it from my hands. "You're turning it the wrong way," I laughed. "I've done that 3 times today." He tightened the fitting with one smooth motion, then handed the wrench back. Neither of us spoke for a while. The only sounds were crickets, distant cattle, and rain beginning to tap softly against the tin roof. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "Your granddad used to stand right there." He pointed toward the open doorway of the shop. "Said he liked watching you work because you never complained." I smiled. "He complained enough for both of us." Ben chuckled. Then his smile faded. "You know, he worried about you." That surprised me. Worried about me. He knew your daddy. Ben looked out across the dark pasture. And he knew what happens when good people mistake being useful for being appreciated. His words stayed with me long after he drove away. Weeks turned into months. Months became years, slowly. Dad's plans became reality. The old horse barn was remodeled into an event space. A section of pasture was fenced off for luxury cabins that hadn't even been built yet. Emily filled social media with polished photos of sunsets she'd never stayed long enough to watch. Online, people called her the heart of Dawson Ranch. I couldn't help laughing the first time I read it. She didn't know the names of half the ranch hands. She'd never delivered a calf. She once asked whether hay had to be watered before feeding it to the horses. But cameras have a way of rewriting the truth. Real work rarely photographs well. One summer afternoon, I found Dad standing on the back porch studying a set of architectural drawings. He didn't look up when I walked over. "The investors love the new proposal." "I'm happy for you. I knew you would be." His tone carried the same quiet arrogance it always did. "We're thinking about tearing down your grandfather's old equipment barn." I froze. "The red barn? It serves no purpose." I stared at him. "Granddad built that barn with his father. It's falling apart. So repair it. It's cheaper to replace it." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, I asked, "Do you remember helping him build it?" Dad gave a short laugh. "No, I remember helping him pay for everything after that." Then he rolled up the drawings and walked inside. That was the first time I realized something I should have understood years earlier. Dad and I hadn't inherited different opinions. We had inherited different memories. When he looked at the ranch, he saw property. When I looked at it, I saw my grandfather. Late that night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the old ranch office. Most of Granddad's belongings had already been boxed away. Dust floated through the moonlight, spilling across the wooden floor. His desk still sat beneath the window. His reading glasses rested exactly where he'd left them. For a long time, I simply stood there. Then I remembered the brass key. I reached into the small wooden box where I'd kept it since the funeral. The metal felt colder than I remembered. I turned it over in my hand. One side was smooth from decades of use. The other carried a tiny engraving I had never noticed before. Archive. Just one word. My heart skipped. Archive? Granddad had never called anything on the ranch an archive. I frowned. Then another memory surfaced. 6 years earlier. I'd seen him disappear into the old records room beneath the ranch office with Walter Briggs. The room hadn't been opened since. I looked toward the hallway leading to the basement. The lights were off. The entire ranch was asleep. The brass key suddenly felt much heavier in my hand. For the first time, I wasn't holding a keepsake. I was holding a door Granddad had expected me to open. For a long time, I simply stood there, staring at the basement door. The ranch office was silent, except for the steady ticking of Granddad's old wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. I'd heard that clock almost every day since I was a child. Granddad refused to replace it, even after it started losing a few minutes every month. "A clock doesn't have to be perfect," he'd always say. "It just has to tell the truth." Funny, I didn't understand what he meant until years later. I tightened my fingers around the brass key. then walked downstairs. The wooden steps groaned beneath my boots. Cool air drifted up from the basement, carrying the familiar smell of dust, cedar, and old paper. Most people avoided this part of the ranch. It wasn't interesting. Just shelves filled with decades of tax records, cattle registrations, insurance files, and weather journals. Granddad used to spend hours down there. Dad called it wasting time. Granddad called it protecting history. The key slid into an old steel door at the back of the room. For a second, it refused to turn. I thought maybe I'd remembered wrong. Then I pushed a little harder. Click. The lock released. The heavy door opened with a long metallic groan. Inside was a room no bigger than a walk-in closet. Steel filing cabinets lined both walls. Everything was perfectly organized, every drawer labeled in Granddad's careful handwriting. Drought records, mineral rights, livestock contracts, property surveys. At the far end stood a black fireproof cabinet. Unlike everything else, it wasn't dusty. Someone had been opening it recently. I frowned. Walter. It had to be Walter. The brass key fit the cabinet perfectly. When I pulled the handle, the door swung open. Inside lay only 3 things: a weathered leather ledger, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front, and a thick blue binder. Nothing else. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. The wax seal still carried my grandfather's ranch brand. I broke it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, which also means someone has probably convinced themselves this ranch belongs to them. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. I kept reading. If I've done my job right, you'll wait before opening the blue binder. Truth is most powerful when people reveal themselves first. I stopped. Reveal themselves? Granddad had expected something. Expected someone. I continued reading. Don't rush. Let them believe what they want. Pride has a way of exposing itself without any help. Suddenly, the last 6 years looked different. Dad's meetings, Emily's social media, the developers, the endless plans to erase everything Granddad loved. He had seen all of it coming, long before any of us had. At the bottom of the page, one final sentence was underlined. Walter knows when the time is right. I stared at the words for a long moment, then reached for my phone. Walter answered on the second ring. I was beginning to wonder when you'd find it. You knew. I've known since your grandfather handed me that key. I looked back at the fireproof cabinet. Why didn't you tell me? Because he wouldn't let me. Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked, what's in the blue binder? Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, has your father changed? I looked upstairs toward the dark ranch house. No. What about Emily? No. Walter sighed quietly. Then it's still too soon. I frowned. It's been 6 years. I know, but your grandfather wasn't waiting for time. He was waiting for certainty. Those words echoed through my mind long after the call ended. I carried the envelope home, but I left the blue binder exactly where it was. For another few months, life continued. Dad announced a multi-million-dollar partnership with a real estate group from Dallas. Emily celebrated online as though she'd built the ranch herself. Construction crews began surveying fields Granddad had sworn would never be developed. One afternoon, I watched bulldozers place orange survey flags across the south pasture. The same pasture where Granddad had taught me to ride. The same pasture where he'd buried our first ranch dog beneath an old oak tree. That evening, I called Walter again. I think we're out of time. His answer came quietly. So do I. The next morning, he arrived carrying the blue binder. Neither of us spoke as we walked into the basement archive. He placed it on the old wooden table, then slowly opened the cover. The first page wasn't a deed, it wasn't a trust, it wasn't a will. It was a notarized transfer agreement, signed, recorded, filed, 6 years earlier. My grandfather's signature filled the bottom of the page. Right beneath it was mine. I stared at it in disbelief. I signed this? Walter nodded. You remember the day your grandfather asked you to sign what he called insurance paperwork after the drought? Fragments of memory rushed back. Stacks of documents, coffee on Granddad's desk, his reading glasses, my signature on page after page without questioning him. I looked up. Oh my God. Walter gently slid another document toward me, the official county recording, stamped, verified, irrevocable. I read the first line twice, then a third time. because I still couldn't believe it. Legal owner, Claire Dawson. Walter folded his hands. Your grandfather transferred controlling ownership to you while he was still alive. He knew your father would never stop chasing the ranch, so he made sure the ranch could never be sold without your signature. I couldn't breathe. For 6 years, my father had been making plans, hosting investors, promising land, and signing agreements for property that legally wasn't his. Walter leaned back quietly. He always believed the truth would eventually catch up with them. I closed the binder. My hands were shaking, not because I had just discovered I owned Dawson Ranch, because I finally understood why my grandfather told Walter to wait. He didn't want revenge. He wanted consequences. And those consequences were only beginning. The board meeting started at 9 o'clock sharp. By 8:30, the conference room overlooking the south pasture was already full. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long golden lines across the polished oak table. Outside, cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that everything about to happen inside would change Dawson Ranch forever. Developers from Dallas arrived carrying leather portfolios. Investment bankers whispered over spreadsheets. Architects unrolled glossy renderings of luxury cabins, wedding venues, and private guest lodges. Everyone smiled. Everyone shook hands. Everyone believed they were about to close the biggest deal in the ranch's history. Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years. He wore Granddad's old silver belt buckle, the one he'd sworn he'd earned. Seeing it around his waist made my stomach turn. Emily moved from guest to guest, introducing herself as the face of Dawson Ranch. Her phone never left her hand. Every few minutes she uploaded another smiling picture. Big things coming. The future starts today. Thousands of strangers celebrated a future that legally didn't exist. I parked my truck across the road and watched through the windshield. For a moment, I almost drove away, not because I was afraid, because once I walked into that room, there would be no family left to save. Walter's truck pulled in beside mine. He stepped out carrying the blue binder beneath one arm. You ready? I looked at the ranch stretching across the hills. The same fences, the same barns, the same windmill. The only thing that had changed was the people living inside it. I nodded once, as I'll ever be. Inside, Dad stood beside a projection screen displaying the words, "The Future of Dawson Ranch." He smiled confidently. Ladies and gentlemen, today marks the beginning of a new chapter. The presentation began. Luxury homes, resort plans, projected profits, investor returns. Every slide earned another round of approving nods. Then came the final page, authorization of property transfer. Dad picked up a fountain pen. This is the easy part, he laughed. So where do I sign? Before anyone answered, the conference room door opened. Every head turned. I walked in. Walter followed quietly behind me. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Emily laughed. I thought we told security not to let her in. Dad didn't even look surprised. He looked annoyed. I believe I made myself clear the other day. I told you to stay off my ranch. The room chuckled politely. They thought this was awkward. They had no idea they were watching history. Walter placed the blue binder on the conference table. The sound echoed through the room. Dad frowned. What is this? Walter didn't answer. He simply opened the binder to the first page. I believe, he said calmly, before anyone signs another document, everyone deserves to see who actually has the legal authority to sell this property. Dad laughed. Oh, for God's sake, are we really doing this? Walter slid the notarized transfer agreement across the table. Dad barely glanced at it. Then he saw the county seal. His smile disappeared. He picked up the document, read the first page, then the second. His eyes moved faster, his face slowly drained of color. That's impossible. Walter remained perfectly calm. It was recorded 6 years ago. Dad looked at me. What is this? I didn't answer. He flipped through more pages. The trust documents, the transfer agreement, the county filings. Every signature, every seal, every notarization, real, irrevocable. Emily reached for the binder. There has to be a mistake. Walter handed her another certified copy. There isn't. She read the first paragraph, then looked at me as if she had never seen me before. Mom whispered, Thomas. Dad ignored her. He slammed both hands onto the table. My father would never do this. Walter finally spoke. Your father did exactly this. He transferred controlling ownership while he was alive. He also included one additional condition. Dad looked up sharply. What condition? Walter turned another page. The room fell completely silent. No sale, no redevelopment, no financing agreement, no transfer of land. May proceed without the written approval of Claire Dawson. Silence, not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. This one felt different. Heavy, final. Every investor slowly lowered their contracts. The lead attorney removed his glasses. One developer quietly closed his briefcase. No one needed an explanation. The deal was already dead. Dad looked at the investors, then back at me. His voice cracked for the first time. You knew? I nodded. I found out. When? A long time ago. His expression shifted from anger to confusion, to something I'd never seen before. Fear, real fear. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the man in control. One investor cleared his throat. Mr. Dawson, I'm assuming you disclosed your ownership before negotiations. Nobody answered. The attorney spoke next. If these representations were inaccurate, we have a serious legal problem. Chairs began sliding backward. Phones came out. People who had been smiling 10 minutes earlier suddenly couldn't leave the room fast enough. Emily looked around desperately. Wait, this is just a misunderstanding. No one listened. Within minutes, the conference room that had been filled with excitement was nearly empty. Only family remained. Dad stood motionless, staring at the documents. The ranch he'd spent 6 years trying to control had never belonged to him. Finally, he looked at me. I was trying to protect this family. I met his eyes. No, you were trying to own it. For the first time in my life, he had no answer. I walked over to the window overlooking the pastures. Granddad used to stand there every evening before going home. I finally understood why. From that window, you couldn't see money, you couldn't see property values, you couldn't see investment opportunities. You only saw open land, hard work, and the people willing to protect both. Behind me, Dad quietly removed Granddad's old silver belt buckle. He stared at it for several seconds, then laid it on the conference table, without saying a word, without asking for forgiveness. Because some apologies arrived too late to change anything. As Walter gathered the documents, he smiled gently. Your grandfather always believed the ranch would end up with the person who loved it most. I looked out across the fields. The morning sun was climbing higher now. The cattle were still grazing. The windmill still turned. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the truth had finally caught up with the people living on it. And for the first time in 6 long years, Dawson Ranch finally belonged to its rightful owner.